So welcome to today's lesson. Today we're going to continue looking at living systems, but we're going to talk specifically about relations between living things within those systems. So we're going to start with these two curious organisms right here, known as dung beetles. Now, as the name implies, these creatures use dung as a food source, which, if you don't know, is really animal feces or animal poop. And they do some different things with it. For example, some beetles are rollers, where they roll it into balls and they literally roll it all around. Some are diggers that dig up holes in the ground and bury them, and some are just dwellers. They just simply live in it. These two particular beetles are fighting over a dung ball right here, and it's amazing the size of these things. In some cases, they can work with a dung ball that's almost 250 times larger than the beetle itself. So the question might come up, why in the world would these organisms fight over animal waste? I mean, what's the deal? Well, within any living system, we have living and non-living components, and these particular beetles are taking advantage of an abiotic component, that is, waste products coming out of living things. And they've created a food source which has given them a competitive advantage because there's no other creature that fits this niche. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at how organisms get energy from their environment and the relationships those organisms have with each other. So when we talk, we look at two general categories of how living things get energy. We have what's known as producers, which is this first picture to our left, and this is a picture of a sugar maple tree. And we know that leaves and green plants use photosynthesis to capture energy from the sun to produce sugar for the plant and produce oxygen for us, which, by the way, is a waste product, not all that different than dung. It just happens to be plant waste that we breathe, by taking in our CO2. So we call those producers because they essentially make their own food. Then we have consumers, which essentially eats producers, like this cow here foraging for food. Now, one thing to remember, if you're a human, you eat plant-based foods like beans or peas or corn, and those foods are producers by nature. But at times we also eat other consumers. If we're eating a hamburger or we're eating ham or chicken, those creatures are also consumers. So we want to classify these animals based on how they get their food. There's other words we use. For example, heterotrophs. This is a descriptive word that we use to describe creatures who get their food from other energy sources. In the same respect, organisms that produce their own food, we call them autotrophs, and our producers are in this category. Now, they don't just use sun. There are some producers in here that would use chemicals to do this also. So it's important to understand then how energy moves from one creature to the next. So let's say we're looking at a lake ecosystem. Here's a small minnow. This minnow is going to eat tiny bugs, tiny organisms in the bottom of the lake. In many cases, fish eat things that are smaller than them, so that's pretty safe to say. So the energy from the creatures that it eats goes into its body. From there, the smaller fish is going to be eaten by a larger fish. Let's say a walleye, a largemouth bass, for example, would eat the minnows. So now its energy from the bugs that it ate goes to that creature. And then finally, some larger creature will come along, maybe an eagle. It might come and catch it and eat it. And we get to the top of that food chain. So in this picture, a food chain is really showing the feeding relationships of one animal. In other words, this is how an eagle gets food. That would be the food chain and all the different things. Now, we could show some more detail here if we showed all the things that the bass might eat and all of the things that the minnow might eat. But basically, we're talking about where the eagle gets the food from in this example. When we move on to what's called a food web, it gets a little more complicated. So we still have all these smaller creatures down below. We have creatures that live in the soil. We have terrestrial plants. We have roots down here that are part of those plants that are doing things. And as we go through this, we can see some different relationships among creatures. So now here's our eagle again, but our eagle can also eat fish. But don't forget, now we have a bird that might eat some of the insects that might be eaten by the fish, depending on what type of fish it is. So when we talk about food webs, we're really talking about the relationships among several different food chains. And we have creatures within a food webs that are higher higher up, which might be top level predators or secondary predators, and we have creatures that are really low on the bottom, such as these consumers. And then additionally we have producers, which live in this plant world here, and we also have some decomposition going on down here where energy is produced too. So the last tool we use to look at ecosystems and relationships among creatures is what's called an energy pyramid. Now, the pyramid is a model and it shows energy relationships amongst different creatures. So at the bottom here, we're going to have our plants at our primary level of our energy pyramid, and these are our autotrophs. These plants in particular are going to get energy from non-living sources. Okay, so they're going to use the sun, they're going to use nutrients that were not alive to produce energy. As we move up this energy pyramid, we might get into some herbivores here, which are going to eat the plants down here. And then we're going to get into our primary predators, which would eat our herbivores, and then we're going to get into our secondary predators at the top. It's important to understand the shape of this pyramid. You'll notice the size of the pyramid is very large at the bottom and it shrinks as you go up top. This will work out for any ecosystem you look at. Basically, you have to have a smaller number of secondary predators or large predators than you do producers. So for every human being that's on the planet Earth, there has to be a whole bunch of plants and producers down here to support our food needs below it. And this goes for any ecosystems. Now this can get out of whack, and if it does get out of whack, and let's say you have too many secondary predators here or higher level predators, then what's going to happen is eventually they're going to die off because the energy pyramid just isn't large enough to support their life.